Welcome to Slices of London. London is like a loaf of bread with endless slices, and you will never get through the whole loaf of bread. I'm going to try. I'm going to do as many of these slices and videos as possible, but London is immense, it's vast. Welcome to Hampstead, a beautiful area, a busy area. Hampstead Tube Station, look at that. I mean, that's absolutely wonderful. It's to me, that encapsulates London. Okay, we're now on Flask Walk. It's a little bit quieter here, as you can hear. One of these beautiful little London alleyways takes its name from the Flask pub, which is just here, yonder, which used to be a bottling plant. So in my introduction, I briefly mentioned the fact that Hampstead was a spa town, and they had a bottling plant. So they used to send the water down into the city of London to the Eagle and Child on Fleet Street. Well, this was a couple of hundred years ago. It was quite a rough pub. It's mentioned in a book called Clarissa by Samuel Richardson, and it's called the Lower Flask, the Upper Flask being Highgate. And the Lower Flask was kind of a rough and tumble pub. It's certainly not a rough and tumble pub today. On this street lived a man called John Beverley. Now, most of you probably won't know who John Beverley is, but some of you who may have been around and fans of a certain genre of music in the mid to late 70s might know who I'm talking about. John Beverley's father was actually a guardsman. He became a musician, and he had a friend called John Lydon, or John Lydon. And he went to John Lydon's house. This is the story I heard anyway. And John Lydon had a hamster called Sid. And apparently he poked his hand into the hamster's mouth and the hamster bit him. And he said, "John, your hamster is really vicious." And so he got the name Sid Vicious, the punk bass player of the Sex Pistols. Now that may not be the correct story, but that is the story I've heard. And I think it's a great story if it's true. But as you can see, this is full of beautiful little kind of cafes, florists. There's a little antique shop down the bottom. People there smiling, very happy to be on camera, by the looks of it, unless they're looking at a friend. No. And it really does sum up. I think this sums up both Hampstead and London to me. These lovely little nooks and crannies of London that you just would walk right past unless you knew they were there. So beautiful Hampstead Street. You've got this wonderful street lamp. You know, another classic London icon. And then these wonderful houses here. You've got a blue door, yellow door, a red door over there. I don't know if we can see that in the shot. These are very much Georgian style, 1700s probably. You know, I mean, more or less. You're okay.
Thank you.
Lovely dog. Hello.
Hello.
Wonderful bay windows, and I love this yellow one with the little pediment on the top of the door. The triangular bit is called a pediment in classical architecture. It's typical Georgian, really, having the pediment on the top and the little square windows and the wonderful bay windows here coming out, sort of projecting almost out onto the front garden there. It's a really wonderful sight, and wouldn't mind living here myself. We're now on Willow Road, and here is a blue plaque. Not a particularly old blue plaque. To two people who I would guess most have not heard of. Milan Kosman, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, and Hans Keller. That one's a little bit easier for me to pronounce. They were Jewish refugees. Milan Kosman escaped from Nazi Germany in 1939, so her family got out just in time. Hans Keller got out of Austria in 1938 during the annexation of Austria, known as the Anschluss. And the two of them were artists. She was an illustrator, painter, and he was a musician. They met and fell in love and got married. Worked together on many things, including a book on Stravinsky, where she did the illustrations and he did the music. And interesting how serendipity works, because in the 90s, a man who was writing all about Eastern Europe and Nazi hunting and those kinds of topics A man called Philip Sands, a lawyer and writer, moved into this property. I have read one of his books, or I've nearly finished one of his books anyway, a wonderful book here called East West Street, so a little bit of a plug for him. I'm getting nothing out of this, by the way, in which we learn about the origins of the term crimes against humanity and the word genocide, about the two different guys who came up with these words and terms, and all about the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. So it's a good read. But it's a wonderful thing. I don't think he knew when he first moved in that he had moved into this house of Jewish refugees. He found that out later. So it's got a wonderful sort of, I don't know, a wonderful sort of serendipitous link. I'm not sure if I even pronounced that correctly, but a link anyway, with what he was doing and who had lived here before. And it used to be, before it was a house, it was a donkey stable. There you are. Now this is number 2 Willow Road. The whole building was built as one piece originally. Numbers 1 and 3, probably 3 is a little bit out of shot at the moment, but 1 and 3 are still privately owned. Number 2 is now a museum, and it was owned by a man called Erno Goldfinger. That's right, you know the name. Most of you will know the name Goldfinger. Now, it was built in the 30s. It's 1939 actually, although it looks later. It's earlier. The National Trust now manages it. They've been managing it since about mid-50s, that sort of time. You can probably Google that one, look that one up. It's got all sorts of artwork inside there, the museum, and it's £11. As I speak in December 2024, it's £11 to enter. I'm not sure, it's probably open sometimes at open house weekends, maybe it's free. But anyway, the story of this is that there were cottages here, and a lot of the residents were very unhappy about the cottages being pulled down to build this. So it's a piece that splits opinion. It is a listed building, designed by, as I mentioned, Erno Goldfinger. Now, he lived in the middle one. He lived in number 2 initially, obviously before it became a museum. And he did know Ian Fleming, and Ian Fleming knew him and of him. They were very different people. Fleming lived in the area, knew about this, didn't like it very much. And so when he decided to write his book, there are all sorts of stories about this. I'm giving you an interpretation of what I understand to be the fact, is that Erno Goldfinger was not particularly well liked by Ian Fleming. He then decided that he liked the name, so he used the name as a villain. Goldfinger was unhappy about the name and was going to, I think he began to sue actually. He began to sue, and what Ian Fleming did was put some sort of preface at the beginning of the book saying that, this is not representing any person alive or that's ever been alive, sent Erno Goldfinger a few copies of the book, and paid some sort of out-of-court settlement. So that's what I understand happened. There's a couple of different versions of this story, but that's sort of more or less it. And so we have a very, very famous James Bond film named after an architect who also designed the Trellick Tower, which is over in West London. Very tall building, which is also listed. You can see it if you're driving along the A40. It's quite near kind of Westbourne Grove tube station, and is mentioned in a song by Blur called Best Days. One of the lines is about waking up in the Trellick Tower in the morning or something like that. So yeah, it's a well-known building, this one, but not architecturally liked by everybody. I'm keeping my own views quiet. Okay, this is Keats' house, which is a bit of a misnomer really, because he never actually owned the house. It was owned by a friend of his called Charles Brown, who invited Keats to come and live there. Keats paid a rent. And eventually the Braun family moved in, and he fell in love with Fanny Braun. Tragically, Keats only lived into his mid-20s. He, as was the case with both of his brothers and his mother, all died of TB, tuberculosis, which did take a lot of people in those days at that time. But he wrote most of his great odes here in this house, which is today a museum. And he was one of the 6 great romantic poets, which included Blake, Coleridge, Byron, Wordsworth, and Shelley. I think that's 5, isn't it? Yes, probably. Anyway, but he was he wanted to be a poet, but he originally trained actually as a doctor. And in his early days, somebody had written a very critical, negatively critical review of his of one of his poems, Endymion, saying something along the lines of "Poor work, Mr. Keats. Time to go back to plasters and ointments. In other words, go back to being a doctor." But it's quite a life. He crammed quite a lot in, really, to have been, to have been a doctor and a poet in his life. It is closed today, which is why we're not able to get quite such a great shot of this in. But worth coming and having a look, and certainly when it's open, worth visiting inside. This is the Magdala pub, and this was the scene in 1955 of a very famous murder case. Ruth Ellis, who killed her lover David Blakeney outside of the pub here. She was the last woman to be hanged in Britain. And there are some rather misleading holes in the side of the pub, which I will show you now. So these are fake bullet holes. For some time, people believed these were actually the bullet holes from Ruth Ellis's gun. Actually, it wasn't her gun. It belonged to a man called Clive Cousins. And it turns out, so far as we know, that the holes were drilled into the wall here in the early 90s by a landlady who had seen several groups outside the pub, on group tours like the tours that I do. And decided it might be quite a good idea to pretend that there were bullet holes in the wall, so to attract more people to obviously come into the pub. It's actually a good pub anyway, so it's worth going into the pub regardless of the fact that these are fake bullet holes, is what I'm trying to say. The body, he was actually found across the road, his body. She was standing over him. The police got her, and there was an off-duty policeman actually, and she just basically just didn't put up any defence, even though she had a lawyer. She said, "Well, I'm guilty," and it was almost kind of like I guess she kind of knew her fate and didn't want to live anymore. Maybe it's a bit of a messy relationship. Both of them were married. They were both cheating on each other and cheating on their married partners, and it is thought that the argument between them began because he was having an affair, although she was as well. Her hangman was a man called Albert Pierpont, who hanged over 400 people, and she was his penultimate case. She was the second to last one he ever hanged. Interestingly, Albert Pierpont, the hangman, said that he did not believe that the death penalty was a deterrent. So there's a great irony in that. So this is St John's, Downshire Hill. Beautiful church, classical style, down in the depths of Hampstead. Not far from the Heath, actually. And it's a proprietary chapel. Now, you might be wondering what that is, and I'll tell you, somebody who would explain it better than me is standing right next to me. This is Corinne, who is the Associate Women's Minister, is that correct?
Indeed.
At the church herself. So, over to you.
Yes, it's a proprietary chapel, and I think that there are 3 main things that make it different from a normal Church of England church. So we do sit within Church of England structures, but unlike most churches, we don't have a parish of our own. We don't have a geographical area that we are responsible for. So we actually sit in another Church of England parish, but that means we don't have boundaries. We're not restricted. The other 2 things are that actually we're financially independent. So actually all the money for the upkeep of the church and for the payment of the ministry is from within the church itself, from within congregational giving. And then we do have a slightly different governance structure. So we don't have a church council, we have trustees within the church.
So you're a charity?
We are a charity, but then most churches would be a charity anyway. So, yes, and as you said, we are It's in the classical style, it's Georgian. We celebrated our bicentennial last year, so it was built in 1823.
Yep.
And it's always had what would be termed an evangelical heritage, which means that actually we put the preaching of the Bible at the centre. We're very much Bible-believing Christians here. We believe it's still relevant for today. And our tagline is living for Jesus, sharing his good news, which we seek to do today. And we've got a very good congregation, like a lot of London churches, international. So about, I think at last count, 28 different nationalities within the congregation.
Wow, wow. So when you say that that you're not within a parish per se, does that mean that you have a lot of people from other areas coming to the church?
That's right, that's right. I mean, I think, as would be the case with quite a lot of London churches, people are used to travelling within London, you know, for where they shop, where they work, and actually that is the true for us as well. So we only probably have a fairly small number that come from Hampstead itself, right. But also from Belsize Park, Golders Green, Finchley, Highgate. So probably within a kind of 3 or 4 mile radius within London.
Oh, yeah. You must be doing quite well, because all those areas have got churches of their own. So if people are coming to yours, there must be something special going on here.
Well, I think it's because we take the Bible seriously, and we have, I think as well, very good children's work going on. So that attracts families. So we've got lots of children, lots of young people. And so it's a very lively and alive church still, where, as I said, we believe that Jesus is very relevant for life today, and the message of the Bible is still the same, hasn't changed.
Wonderful, and I hear that you have very good concerts here as well.
Well,
I did notice you're doing some sort of jazz carol concert.
That's right,
or maybe
yes.
That's gone already.
It has,
yes.
But it was last weekend, or the weekend before last, and we are very fortunate to have a lot of very good musicians and singers within church. So yeah, doing carols within a jazz style. So we had it set up inside for a like a jazz cafe. So 20 years ago, the church interior was reordered. Previously, there were some very traditional box pews in the centre of the church. They've been kept but moved to the side. So we've got chairs, movable chairs in the centre, which means we've got a space that is flexible for the needs of the church today.
Right, okay, wonderful. Yes, so just up the road from that wonderful church, St John's Downshire Hill, on Downshire Hill itself, is this beautiful house, which was once owned by Jim Henson, the creator of the Muppets. You would be right to think that Jim Henson was an American. He was. And the Muppets, of course, was produced in America originally, as far back as the 50s, believe it or not. It goes back a long, long way, a long time before we think. But he loved London, so he came to live here in London and lived in this house. And as you can see from the dates, sadly, these are not the dates that he lived here. These are the dates that he lived. So he died in his 50s and began creating the Muppets in, well, he was, I think, barely 20 years old or so when he started creating them. Him and his wife, actually, they were a team. Yeah, Keats Pharmacy here. We've got on the Hampstead High Street. Making use of the name, the poet John Keats, and it does make sense because, of course, as we know, Keats began life as a surgeon. Well, he began life as a baby, actually, but you know, he trained to be a surgeon. So this is St John's Hampstead. This is the Hampstead Church, Hampstead Village Church. St John's Downshire Hill that we saw earlier was in fact used as what's called a chapel at ease, or chapel of ease, which is the overflow. So when this one was too full, new people that came to the area that wanted a church to go to would have gone to St John's Downshire Hill. There was a bust to John Keats inside there, who we've already come across on this tour. And then we've got some fairly well-known people buried on both sides of the graveyard here. You've got John Constable and his family on this side, John Constable the artist, and also John Harrison, who's the guy who discovered the problem of longitude at sea. And over on the other side, you've got Anton Walbrook, the Llewellyn-Davies family, and Hugh Gateskill. Anton Warnbrook was an actor. He was in probably his most well-known part, I would imagine, was in The Red Shoes. And Hugh Gateskill, who was sometimes been described as the greatest Labour leader that never became Prime Minister, although I'd have to chuck John Smith into the reckoning for that part too. And the middle of Sylvia Llewellyn-Davies' children, she had 5. The middle son was Peter, who befriended a writer called J.M. Barrie, and is the inspiration for Peter Pan. So you come out of the church of St John's and you step onto Church Row. Beautiful street. Again, this is Georgian architecture. It's at least early 1700s anyway, but I think it's probably a little bit later, so Georgian. There are a couple of idiosyncrasies on the street as well, but you know, that'll be for another time, perhaps a walking tour. Living on this street over the years have been H.G. Wells, the writer of War of the Worlds, Compton Mackenzie, who wrote Whiskey Galore, and was also incidentally a founder of the Scottish Nationalist Party, and George de Maurier, who we've already met, who wrote, of course, Trilby. So Church Row is kind of a writer's enclave. In fact, Hampstead is really very much an artist's enclave. A beautiful area. As I say, I've scraped the surface today really with this. There's probably 2, maybe 3 tours of Hampstead I could do. And then I still may not have even covered all of it. But thank you for watching, and please join me again for another edition of Slices of London. Thank you and goodbye.